burning. On Saturday night, a peaceful protest in the Tottenham area over police shooting and killing the father of four turned violent, with youths rampaging.
The mist had come in through the window, diffusing the grey light of no particular time of day. I was lying on the floor. I'd been there long enough to stiffen. Some of the time I'd been unconscious. The rest I'd just been getting colder. It was my mother's house. I'd gone back to stay there. I do that when I'm at the bottom of the low, but I shouldn't. Particularly when the house is not actually my mother's, but just a derelict one that feels a bit like it. Towards the end, she had no windows either. This one also had broken doors, and only some of its floors. I'd started this low by hanging around the bars of theme pubs, conspicuously dosing myself with Rohypnol and waiting for someone to drug rape me. I'd scored it on credit off a minicab driver, who, though himself a successful rapist, was foolish enough to trust me because of my accent. Of course, I had no real proof it was Rohypnol, but whatever it was wearing off now, and I was checking to see if anyone had pleasured me in the last 24 hours. And then there was a knock on the main plank across the front door. I pushed my head through a broken pane in Mother's front sitting room. A young cyclist stared back at me with a smug grin and a silver envelope. "It's an invitation to Suzy's wedding," he said. I told him she had a pretty odd way of accepting a proposal. He laughed one ha. I told him how Suzy had kissed me, and how shortly afterwards I had proposed to her in a letter enclosed in a sea bass. She hadn't replied exactly, but she had thrown it into the sea, which was perhaps a posh way of saying yes. He looked dubious. The posh do things differently, I said. He suggested that perhaps I open the envelope. Inside was an invitation, in illegible copperplate, a red card in quilted silk, with a pair of alloy lovebirds canoodling in the centre, and a handwritten note that said, "Come at once, I must talk to you at once, Suzy, kiss." Suzy's house was a bustle of caviar and champagne, and about a dozen female strangers with familiar faces. She kissed me all over the place, gushed, "You know everyone, of course," and left me facing a wall. I stayed that way because it felt safe. I could hear her bustling around, dizzily issuing "we musts" and fetching congratulations. "We always knew it would be him," I said. It's because she understands me, I thought. Suzy's voice swept over my shoulder. "And you, my darling, will give me away." She squeezed me through my trousers. I turned towards the noise. She looked suddenly intense. "You know how much I loved Daddy, and now he's dead, well, I needed someone special, and I wondered if perhaps it could be you." Then she added, "And you are by far the oldest looking of my friends." She smiled again, and her eyes done as sexy. "So are you marrying me?" I said. "Sort of." "Shouldn't I have given you a ring?" She looked kinder now than a village baker lady, and kissed me softly on the forehead. "You'll be standing right next to me," she said. "It's just standing up in front of people for a while." As she receded, and I renewed my congress with the wall, the room around me hummed and crackled with talk of men. In particular, a man called William. And a broken memory surfaced like a puff of something half gone and awful. A crass, beaming face, too much nodding, Suzy laughing, nudging me and saying, "Sometimes you should laugh like William." And slowly, without knowing why, I began to feel about as sad as it is possible to feel while staring at a wall in a room full of women. 3 or 4 times in the next 6 months, Suzy had me round for a feed. People were unusually nice to me, especially William, who, having materialized, looked older than the face in the memory, but still boomed at me excitedly and slapped my back whenever possible. Otherwise, life continued in the usual blur of frowns, doctors, lying down, and people saying, get the fuck out of my garden. And then suddenly we were all in a church surrounded by fields. I was stood next to Suzy and William. Behind us a stew of faces. At the altar were two priests, both in informal robes like kimonos. Both were thin, and both, I learned later, had AIDS. Julius was gay. Crispin had an unlucky transfusion. Later still, I found out it wasn't unlucky at all. He'd deliberately taken on contaminated blood because he believed that underneath he was intrinsically a promiscuous homosexual and felt guilty he'd never had the nerve to do anything about it. Both priests looked similar, but you could tell them apart because all the girls loved Julius. To begin with, Julius did most of the talking, almost chatting and smiling frequently in our direction. I couldn't hear all the words above the drumming that generally bothers me on large occasions, but whenever he raised his voice, I felt obliged to say, "Not bad, thanks. How about you?" He smiled kindly when I did this. When Crispin took over, he turned his attention increasingly to Suzy and William and became more solemn and started holding their hands. At one point, I heard him say, "Let him now speak or forever hold his peace." There was a silence. Suzy winked at me. William smiled, and a little git of panic broke onto my diaphragm. "Who gives this woman to this man?" said Crispin. Suzy looked at me again. I looked at Crispin, at William, and a man next to him holding a ring. And I began to see with the clarity of cold gin where this one was going. I said nothing. "Who gives this woman to this man?" Crispin said again. I knew what I had to say, but the only way I could think of saying "I do" was to say "fucked if" first. I just stared back at them, trapping the response in my mouth so tight my lips ached. So Suzy jabbed me in the cummerbund, which made me say "Run." It was good enough for them. They continued. I didn't want that. I made a longer noise. Crispin stopped. I made it again and slapped my face to add importance. He looked worried. "Is there a problem?" he whispered. The stained glass behind him, which included, at Suzy's insistence, a panel featuring the Rolling Stones as 5 of the 12 apostles, began to rotate and was joined by the nave and transept. I heard my voice saying yes, and I agreed with it. His eyes widened. "I have a problem with this marriage," I blurted. "What?" said the priest. William's face flared a gale warning, and Suzy looked appalled, but was unable to suppress a slight wiggle. "The problem, I seem to be saying, is William." At the back, someone cheered. Relatives gasped in disbelief. William gave a warning grunt, and I remembered everything. I remembered young versions of William and myself, and 4 others who escorted Suzy. I remembered how people called us her brood, how she had always confided that of the 6, it was me whom she had genuinely earmarked for marriage. How sometime during all of this, I'd flown off the thread and collapsed too far even to realize how far I had collapsed. So here I was, staring at William, the dullard, the dependable, whose moderate fortune now stood him proudly above all his time-debauched peers, and who, most importantly of all, would be far too loyal to suspect Suzy's affairs. "What is your objection?" Crispin was saying. I pointed at William. "He is a tit," I said. Silence. 3 or 4 male laughs immediately stifled by female glares. 1 female laugh unrestrained. Objections. A priest whispering, "Fuck." Rough hands tight round my biceps, under my arms, my knees. Sudden jagged daylight, lying on my back, and 4 angry male faces dark against the sun. One of them I recognize as William's brother, all of them ranting about smashing my head in. Then 3 girls joining in and saying, no, he needs help. And eventually all of them compromising on beating me up with drugs. I remember nothing of the reception. Apparently, I was swaddled in Egyptian cotton in a bedroom upstairs. Apparently, William came up to say no hard feelings, and I tried to push him out of the window. Suzy herself told me later that her grandmother had paid me a kindly visit, and I had told her how Suzy and Imogen had once used bacon to make Granny's Doberman lick their vaginas.
Hey, some people are made of plastic.